Thanks for checking out the weekly sermon from Church of the Resurrection. I pray that God will use this message to speak to you and help you grow in your faith journey. If you're in the KC area, I'd like to invite you to join us next week at one of our services, or join us in live worship online at core.org/worship. Church of the Resurrection is one church in multiple locations. To learn more about the service times in our ministries, please visit core.org. Hope you enjoy this week's message.
As we continue in worship, I invite you to hear these words of Scripture from the Gospel of Mark. At 3, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you left me?" Then Jesus let out a loud cry and died. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they could go and anoint Jesus' dead body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they came to the tomb. They were saying to each other, "Who's going to roll the stone away from the entrance for us?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, and it was a very large stone. Going into the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe seated on the right side, and they were startled. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him. Go tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you."
This is Easter weekend, and the theme for this weekend's sermon, the Easter message, is "It may be Friday, but Sunday's coming." Now, this is a title that comes from sermons that have been preached. Generations of pastors, primarily in the African-American tradition, have shared this sermon title in their Easter sermons. I want to share it with you today, and I want you to say it again with me. It may be Friday, but Easter's coming. Let's begin with Friday. Now, our Jewish friends count the day from sunset to sunset, and so Friday of Holy Week began actually on what we would call Thursday night. By this way of reckoning time, it was Friday when Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. It was Friday when the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane deserted Jesus. It was Friday when Simon Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times in the high priest's courtyard. It was Friday. It was Friday when Jesus was arrested, taken to the house of the high priest, where he was there put on trial, condemned of blasphemy, and sentenced to death. It was Friday when they covered his eyes and they began to hit him on the head. It was Friday when they spat upon him and the soldiers beat him, and then they took him to Pontius Pilate. It was Friday when Pontius Pilate sat in the judgment seat, and he asked the crowd, "What should I do with the one called the King of the Jews?" It was Friday when they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." It was Friday when Pontius Pilate delivered him to the Roman soldiers who took him and beat him. They plaited a crown of thorns and placed it upon his brow, and then they began to strike him on the head again and again and again, spitting upon him, humiliating him. It was Friday when they took him to crucify him. It was 9 a.m. on Friday when they nailed him to the cross, hoisted him into the air, and for the next 6 hours he hung there in excruciating pain. It was Friday as the crowds walked by, hurling insults at this suffering man. It was Friday at 3 p.m. when he spoke his last words. Luke and John tell us lofty things that Jesus says from the cross, but Mark only remembers one thing that Jesus says just before he dies: my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was Friday. Friday comes for all of us. We've all experienced Friday in our lives, painful moments, times that seem so dark, times where God seems conspicuous by his absence. We wonder, how in the world can we make it through this? Friday comes when we wish we were not alive or perhaps had never been born. Friday is the pain in life, the adversity, the suffering, the mental anguish, the physical anguish. Sometimes it's the tragedy Sometimes it's death. A week or two ago, a young woman posted a question for me on Twitter. And this was her question: Pastor Adam, is it okay? She says, this is going to sound like a strange question, but is it okay to be angry with God? I was immediately drawn to want to respond to her tweet. And my response was, it's okay to be angry with God. The psalmists were regularly angry with God. Moses and Elijah at times were, if not angry with God, deeply disappointed with God. There's a fine line between anger and disappointment. And we see that when Jesus hangs on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's okay to be angry with God. And sometimes God is angry with us. I assumed that she was thinking about the pain that was happening in the world around us, in particular, the violence that had taken place in Boulder and also in Atlanta. She responded and she said, I am angry with God because he took my mom. Well, I said, let's talk. Let's connect. And so this last Monday, she and I had a chance to connect over Zoom. We talked about her Friday. We talked about the loss of her mother and the tremendous pain that she'd experienced from that, was still experiencing in tears as she told me about it on the Zoom call. But we didn't only talk about Friday. We talked about Sunday. Sunday. Now, Jesus was buried on Friday. He was buried on Friday in a borrowed tomb. It was late in the afternoon before sunset, hastily buried because it was not appropriate to be able to touch and prepare a dead body for burial after the Sabbath began, which was at sunset on Friday. So very quickly at 3 o'clock or shortly after that, he was taken down from the cross, hastily prepared for burial, placed in a borrowed tomb. Now, I thought it might be interesting for you to know a little bit about Jewish burial practices in the time of Jesus. There are lots and lots of tombs that have been found in the hillsides around Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built upon limestone rock. Everywhere you look, just barely under the surface, limestone rock. And so tombs were hewn or carved or cut out of the limestone. And I thought it'd be interesting for you to see just a little bit about this. I love archaeology, and so having been to the Holy Land many times, I stumbled upon this tomb on Mount Scopus several years ago. What's interesting about this tomb is it was carved into the mountainside, but the ceiling fell in, and so now you can see the entire tomb. And I want you to notice several things. I want you to notice this bench, three-sided, and on that bench is where those who had died would have been placed. The opening to the tomb was here. They were placed on the benches, and there was room for 3 persons to be in state or to have died and be in this place at any given time. You see, these were family tombs, and so one didn't know how quickly a family member might die. There was a place, and Jesus would have been laid, we think, here. Now, the body was left there for a period of time. It was left there for a year or more. And later, the body was, someone would come back and they would disassemble the skeleton. They would place the bones after decomposition into a box. The box is called an ossuary. And I want to show you what the ossuaries look like. These are ossuaries from the Mount of Olives. And this was a tomb. And you see a number of these ossuaries. Each one would have contained one set of bones, sometimes more than that, but usually one set of bones. Now, what would happen is after the body had been placed in the ossuaries then were placed in these niches. And typically there was room for 3 sets of 3 ossuary in each one of these niches. This room, however, is opened up into the mountainside back here, and there was room for 20 ossuary in that one place. This is a tomb in much finer condition. This is the tomb of Nicanor, and you see here the niche, and here there would have been room for multiple ossuary inside this niche. This is the ossuary of Nicanor. So as we think about this gives us a sense of what was happening on that day when Christ was buried. He was hastily prepared for burial. He was placed in the tomb. A shroud was placed around him. A stone was rolled in front of the tomb. The openings were fairly small. The stones, we found 4 round stones in Jerusalem, and they're about 4.5 feet in diameter, about 12 inches wide, and weigh about 2,000 pounds. The stone was rolled into place after Jesus' body was placed there. Now, he stayed in the tomb Saturday, Friday night, Saturday night. Sunday morning, after the Sabbath was over, the women came. 3 women came, Mark tells us, to the tomb. They came to finish the burial preparations. Many Jewish people believed then and today that the soul hovers around the body for 3 days after death, and this gives time for the proper burial. Jesus had not been properly buried yet. He had been buried on Friday late afternoon. He remained there for roughly 40 hours from Friday afternoon until Sunday morning. And now the women have come. The stone has been rolled away. They're surprised. They had wondered who would roll the stone away. They trim their olive oil lamps, and they enter into the tomb, and they are terrified by what they see. In the bench where Jesus' body should have been, there is no body there, but instead there is a young man dressed in white, perhaps an angel. And that young man speaks and gives them this Easter message. Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him. Go tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he's going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you. That's the Easter story in Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel has a truncated ending. Somehow the rest of the story was left off. And in the 2nd century, someone added the rest of the story drawn from Matthew, Luke, and John. But whatever the original ending was of Mark, this is what we have. And when we get to the end of this, we find the women are terrified. They are terrified by what's happened, by the man that they have seen there. And they run out of the tomb and they don't tell anybody. They're afraid and they don't know what to think. I want to acknowledge here for just a moment that belief in the resurrection, belief in Easter, is hard. Like, it's not easy to believe that Christ rose from the dead. And so we find the women are terrified, but they don't immediately tell the disciples, even though the angel told them to. It's only after one of them sees Jesus that she finds this belief that he actually has risen from the grave. When the women went to tell the disciples you would think would believe, but they don't believe. They think the women are out of their mind. They run to the tomb, find an empty tomb, no angel there. They go back. They don't believe until Jesus appears to them that afternoon. Thomas, one of the 12 disciples, is not with the disciples. They tell him, Thomas, we've seen the Lord. He's risen from the grave. He says, no, I don't believe it. No way do I believe that. Not until I touch his hands and his side will I believe. Jesus appears to him a week later. Finally, he believes. Then we find that there is a man, we find that there are about 500, Paul tells us, 500 different people who saw Jesus at some point during the next 40 days, but even those who saw him, some didn't believe. And then there is Paul himself, who heard the story and he thought it was hogwash. He said, there's no way this is true. And he begins arresting these Christians who are telling that Jesus had been raised from the dead, until one day he's blinded by a light and he hears the voice of Jesus saying, I really am alive. I am the one you're persecuting. And his life was radically changed. He went on to write half the letters or half the books of our New Testament. It's hard to believe this. This is a difficult thing to believe. When I was 14 years old, I began reading the Gospels. And I loved Jesus, and I loved the things he said and the things he did. And I got to the end, and he was crucified. And I thought, what a tragic end to his story. And then I read the resurrection, and I thought, there's no way that happened. I just don't believe that happened. And somewhere along the way, something struck me. I learned later the arguments you can make for how the disciples' lives were changed and there was an empty tomb and all of these things that were evidence of Christ's resurrection for many people. But if you're skeptical, you're not certain about those things. Here's what happened for me, 2 things. The first was that the resurrection began to make logical sense to me. If God actually had come to us in the flesh in Jesus in some mysterious way, if somehow Jesus represented God, was the Son of God, as Christians have said, then if he is crucified, dead, and buried, tortured to death and buried, and that's the end of the story, first of all, we wouldn't know about him. But second, that's a terrible ending to this story. How can that be? Because what that says is that evil and hate, sin and death have the final word. And I think Easter is God's way of saying that none of those things ever get the final word. Easter is God's definitive word to us saying, listen, I know life is hard sometimes, life is difficult, but the difficulties, the pain, the adversity, the cruelty, the inhumanity, they never get to have the final word. And how would God teach us that? How would God show us that? By the resurrection of Christ from the grave. The other reason why I believe in the resurrection of Christ is because I've experienced his presence in my life, heard his voice speaking to me, known his love, felt his presence guiding and leading me. And for those reasons, I believe in the resurrection. But I understand why it's hard. I want to say again, the resurrection of Jesus is God's response to all the world's Fridays. God knows we're going to walk through Fridays, and God is saying, listen, I want you to know Friday is never the end of the story. Not in your life, not in the world. On that first Easter morning, when Jesus rose from the grave, this represented the triumph of light and life and love over hate and evil and darkness. And because of this, Frederick Buechner would say, and we say this a lot around here, that Easter means the worst thing is never the last thing. It may be Friday, but Sunday is coming. God does not promise that life won't be hard. I think it's important for us to recognize this. This is the conversation I had with this young woman on Zoom this last week. God doesn't promise that life is not going to be hard. I mean, how could we possibly believe that when God walked among us, God's son Jesus is walking among us, and he allows his son to experience the kind of torture and death that he experienced, the betrayal and the denial and the harm and the pain and the crucifixion. I mean, if God himself was not exempted from this, if he did not exempt his own son from the suffering in the world, why would we think that God exempts any of us from that suffering? I mean, here's the thing. We live in a world where life is sometimes hard, where Fridays come. Now, we have to acknowledge this. Friday is one of 7 days in the week. Like most of the time, life is good, right? We enjoy each other's company. We don't experience the pain and heartbreak that sometimes we experience. Our physical bodies heal themselves. How amazing is that? We have doctors and nurses and medication that can help us. I mean, all of these things are a part of how we live our lives. We might get a cold, but we get better after that. I mean, this is life. There are storms that come, but then the sunshine and the rainbows come after that. I mean, we recognize that most of life is good. We live in a good world, and our bodies are good, and the world is good, but there are Fridays that come in our lives. Fridays come. Sometimes they're storms. Sometimes they're adversity. Sometimes they're people rejecting us or hurting us. Sometimes they're the cruelty with which we treat one another as human beings. Sometimes they're natural disasters. Sometimes they're cells that go haywire in our body. Fridays come. And God didn't promise that Fridays wouldn't come. He didn't promise that he would exempt us from that or somehow supernaturally and miraculously deliver us from all of these things. Here's what he promised. I'm going to walk with you through them. I myself in Jesus have walked through them. I'm going to walk with you. I'm not going to leave you or forsake you. Even when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you don't have to be afraid, for I'm going to be with you. This is what God promises. And then he promises that he's going to force something good to come from the tragedy. He doesn't cause it, but he says, I'm going to redeem it. I'm going to bend something good. I'm going to wring good from this tragedy that you experience in life and in this world. That's what God has promised. That's what we see in the crucifixion and resurrection story. For that angry young woman, or the young woman who was upset at that time about her mother, we had this conversation, and as we talked about this, I said, God didn't give your mother this sickness. I don't believe that God gives his children illness or sickness. He doesn't intend to hurt them, but illness and pain sometimes happen in life. And God walked with your mother through that and with you and cares for you, and she lived much longer than maybe she was ever expected to live. But when God saw that her body could not hold out anymore, when there was more pain than joy in her life, he welcomed her into her eternal home. Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you, and if I do, I'll come back for you, that you might be with me where I am. He didn't take her away from you. He stopped her suffering so that she might be with him in a place of unending joy. It may be Friday, I told her, but Sunday is coming. The resurrection faith changes how we live, how we face adversity, how we face pain, how we face hardship, how we face death, our own and the death of other people. Some of you heard me share a couple of weeks ago, a good friend of mine, Junius Dotson. He was 55 years old. United Methodist pastor, the leader of our denominational efforts in discipleship. He'd preached here on several occasions, a really good guy. And he called me one day to tell me that he had been diagnosed with a terrible form of cancer. He'd been feeling sick to his stomach. He went to the hospital, and the doctor said, we have bad news, and we think you should go to a hospital that specializes in this. And he went to MD Anderson in Texas. And when he got there, he went in to be seen by them. He was feeling ill one day. They'd started the process of trying to understand what was going on in his body. And he felt particularly ill one day, and he went back to the hospital. And as they examined him more closely, they said, Junius, we're sorry, there's nothing else that we can do for you. But we think you should stay at the hospital tonight because you're in such pain. We'll see if we can alleviate the pain. His family lived in Houston, but no family members could be there in the hospital because of COVID. A good friend had traveled there with him, a co-laborer in Christ, Tosca, who'd acted as his assistant many times and in her work as a leader of another organization. And that night, Tosca was so concerned about Junius spending the night alone in the hospital that she asked the nurses, could you set up Junius's laptop there on the table next to him and set up a Zoom call, and I'll keep my computer open, and the Zoom call will be continuous through the night. And that way, if in the middle of the night he needs something, or he's afraid or scared or hurting, he can cry out, and I can be awakened, and I can call for help for him. Or I can talk to him and just care for him. And so they set up this Zoom call, and he went to sleep, and she went to sleep, and in the middle of the night, she was awakened. And she sat up and she looked at the Zoom at her computer screen and saw Junius on the other side of the computer in his hospital room. And he looked at her and he said, Tosca, God can be trusted. God can be trusted. What Junius knew is he wasn't going to live very much longer, but Junius knew also that it may be Friday, but Sunday's coming. He was a person of the resurrection, a person of deep faith. He knew that this life was not all there is, and he knew what the Apostle Paul said was true, that when this life is over, we have a building not made by human hands, eternal in the heavens, and that because of the resurrection, death has been vanquished or swallowed up in victory. This is a picture of Junius the last time he preached here at Church of the Resurrection. And when we had his service a couple of weeks ago, it was a celebration of his life, a celebration of the resurrection of Easter. Because Christ lives, we shall live also. Now, Easter Sunday changed how the disciples saw Friday. Up to that point, as they went through Friday and Saturday, what they saw was despair. They saw the fact that evil had seemed to win. They undoubtedly were profoundly disappointed with God. And on Friday, one of them, Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, actually took his own life, overwhelmed with sorrow and shame. The rest of them went into hiding. But in the light of the resurrection, they saw Friday differently. It wasn't just Friday anymore. It was Good Friday. They saw that on the cross, this wasn't just evil having the final word. This was God working through that evil to bring about something redemptive and good and beautiful. They now suddenly saw Jesus hanging on the cross, and they remembered his words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They saw him offering himself on behalf of the human race to win our grace, God's grace and mercy for us, to pay a price for us so that we might know the costliness of God's forgiveness and the impact of our sin on God's life. So that, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said, what has cost God much cannot be considered as light or as nothing to us. That Christ showed us the costliness of God's grace. We have a picture of sacrificial and selfless love on the cross, but it's more than that. Those Christians, those early disciples looked at the cross and they began to see in the light of the resurrection, this was also a picture of the divine love, God's love for us. Jesus had said, "Greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for their friends." How can we possibly describe the depth of our love when we love someone deeply? I tried this the other day with my granddaughter. She's 7 years old, and I told Stella, I said, "Stella, I just want you to know, I love you so much. Your papa loves you so much that if I had to, I would lay down my life for you. I wouldn't even have to think twice about it." I'd been praying for a young man in our congregation who had just had a heart transplant. I'd been praying morning, noon, and night for him. And so he was on my mind, and I told Stella about this young man, and I said, he needed to have a heart transplant. His heart stopped working, and there was somebody in a terrible accident, and their heart became available, and so consequently, he was able to have a new heart, and somebody had died, but he had a chance to live. And I said, "Stella, if I knew you needed a heart, and I would give you mine, I would ask them to take it. That's how much I love you." I mean, you've said the same thing to children or grandchildren or other people. This is how much I love you. Jesus says on the cross, this is how much I love you. This is the depth of God's love. What wondrous love is this that caused the Lord of bliss to lay aside his crown for us? This kind of love, divine love, is meant to produce a divine love in us. When we recognize you are loved, and I want you to hear that, you are loved relentlessly and fiercely by a God who knows your name and your story and every part of you. He loves you so much that Christ came to show you the depth of his love. That's how much he loves you. But you are meant in receiving that love to find your own heart changed, to find that you suddenly are called and find yourself living into that same kind of selfless love towards other people. I saw this recently as I sat down with Brad Adams and his children, Jonathan and Jefferson and Caroline. They had just lost their mother. This is a picture of Rebecca, her husband Brad, and her kids. Becky, or Rebecca, had for years, 8 years, struggled with a terrible disorder. It's frontotemporal dementia. And this destroys the frontal lobe of the brain. It destroys the higher level thinking and the functioning that happens in the front lobes of the brain. It's a disease that not enough money is going towards in research. And hopefully more and more people will be examining this and looking for cures or at least ways of addressing this early on. But that's not happened up to this point. And so for 8 years, she had suffered with this. And during that 8-year period of time, about 5 years ago, she took her last family vacation with the kids. And 3 years ago, she stopped talking, maybe a word here or there. 2 years ago, there wasn't another word. And then she couldn't recognize anyone anymore. And Brad continued to take care of her. He hired someone to help during the daytime so he could go to work. And in the evening, he would come home and he would bathe her and he would help her to the bathroom, help take care of her. All of the things that you can imagine would be done, he was doing for her, dressing her, all of these things. On the weekends, he'd have occasional help on Saturdays so he could go to the grocery store, but the rest of the time caring for her. And as we sat there talking about her life, he told me what she was like before. And she had she'd worked with Child Protective Services. And he said she would come home from working with these children and she would be in tears agonizing for them, giving herself to try to help them. And the title of the sermon that I gave in the funeral was called, That's What Love Looks Like. And I kept thinking, and in fact, I described this at the memorial service. I said, that's what love looks like. She would cry when she was out trying to help save and rescue these children. Then she went to be a school counselor, and there was a child whose teeth were terribly crooked, and she came home and she said to Brad, I don't care what you say, we're going to give to help this child have straight teeth. We want her to have a chance at a future with hope. And she gave money and raised money in order for this child to have a second chance. That's what love looks like. But then as her illness began to take over and as she lost her abilities, it was her children who came alongside her and the workers who cared for her. These weren't just doing this for a job. They deeply cared for Rebecca, for Becky. And that's what love looks like. But it was as Brad was describing for me how he cared for Rebecca. And then he finally said this, in the last 2 years when she couldn't respond, and I was bathing her and clothing her and taking care of her in these ways, he said, I came to love her more than I'd ever loved her before. It was such a powerful thing. I got choked up when I was sitting there. I began to tear up as I heard him describe this. And what was interesting was, that deep love that he developed for her had nothing to do with a reciprocal relationship. She couldn't love him back. It had nothing to do with intimacy. It had nothing to do with romance. It had everything to do with practicing selfless love, which in turn created a deep love within his heart and life for his wife, Rebecca. That's what love looks like. Like the disciples, we can look back at Friday, the Fridays in our lives, in the light of the belief in the resurrection, the knowledge that Christ has risen, that the worst thing is never the last thing. It leads us to look back at the sorrow and the pain and the adversity in our lives, and we can see how in those things God took them and redeemed them. It's not that he caused all of those bad things to happen, but he took them and he brought something good and beautiful from them. I don't know if this is true for you, but in my life, the most painful experiences I've had across the course of my 56 years, I can look back at all of them and see how God redeemed them or brought something good from them. The person I am today and the best parts of who I am were all somehow forged by the adversity that God took and redeemed in my life. That leads me finally to this. The original ending to the Gospel of Mark, I may have mentioned earlier, was truncated. Something happened to it. We don't know. If you read the Gospel of Mark chapter 16 this week, you'll find after the 8th verse, there is a subsequent ending that was added. And in the 2nd century, somebody said, we recognize this is not the right ending of the story. There's something that was lost somehow. And so they took the pieces of Matthew's account, Luke's account, John's account, and sewed together a final account of the resurrection of Easter and what Jesus said and did after he appeared to his disciples. Now, it's not the same theology as Mark's theology. It's not the same wording. You can tell it's different. But I love how it ends. It says this, they went out and proclaimed the message everywhere. The Lord worked with them, confirming the word by the signs associated with them. And here's what I want you to recognize. In all 4 of the Gospels after Easter, Jesus called them to do something in response. Right? It's not enough to believe that it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. It's not enough to believe that the worst thing is never the last thing. If we are going to be instruments of Christ's hope in the world, then we have to live the crucified love. We have to live selfless love, be instruments or incarnate that love, and we have to be embodying the hope of the resurrection. That means we act in ways that bring hope to other people. We demonstrate selfless love to them. So when we do that, part of what happens is that we make hope a reality for other people. Again, it's not enough simply to believe this. We have to act upon it. And somehow in the acting upon it, in demonstrating selfless love, and in serving other people and offering them hope, we find that hope grows inside of us as well. In the midst of the suffering and the pain in the world, we're to be instruments of this hope. This last year, listen, has been a really hard year. 550,000 people have died of COVID or COVID-related causes in our country alone. Some of you lost loved ones. There were people I cared deeply about, whose funerals I celebrated this year. In the midst of that, there were some who were left socially isolated, some who struggled with depression, anxiety, fear, some who wrestled with depression, some were struggling with addictions in the middle of that. Mental health became a critical issue. The COVID virus left people struggling with unemployment, unable to pay the bills. There are many people who have gone back to work, but there are still millions who have not. There are people who are living without hope. And what we're meant to do is to embody that hope and to demonstrate the selfless love of the cross so that people can find in their own lives that the worst thing is never the last thing and that there is always hope. It's been a year when racism and injustice were once more at the center of our national conversation, when we saw things that were horrible and we were forced to deal with the reality that racism still exists. And in the midst of that, we were meant to incarnate selfless love and to embody the hope of the resurrection, to demonstrate that it may be Friday, but Sunday's coming, and that Sunday may be a long way off, but we're going to be a part of bringing Sunday here by the actions that we take, by the way that we live in working for inclusion of all people and equity for everyone and valuing the diversity we have as human beings. It was a year when there was a great political divide, such polarization that families were torn apart, our country was nearly torn apart. And in the midst of that, we were meant to be people, those who believe in the resurrection, those who are followers of Jesus, to practice selfless love towards our neighbor of another political party or someone who saw things completely different. And we were called not to be right, we were called to demonstrate love. And we were called to be instruments of hope as we cared for people and helped them find hope. It was a year of Fridays, but we believe Sunday is coming. This looks like the kind of daily thing that we do as followers of Jesus Christ, the crucified and resurrected Messiah, when we go out into the world every day and we seek to live out our faith in demonstrations of love and kindness. As a church, we've tried to do that this last year. I've been so proud of you as a congregation, the myriad of ways in which you have served. You have given so much of your time and resources to caring for people who might feel hopeless, to help them find that there is hope, to come alongside people who are broken, to help people in support groups. And we were doing this by Zoom and every kind of technology we could use. We were coming alongside people at the hospitals, recognizing the frontline workers and how they were struggling. And so we showed up at the hospitals with meals, with signs, with cards we would send to the teachers who were struggling, trying to figure out, how do I teach these kids by Zoom or over an iPad, and the frustration of that. And in all of those places, letters to the teachers and meals and things that we took to them, ways that we recognize the hungry who are in our community. And you gave over 1 million pounds of food to area food pantries, trying to come alongside and help. Drop by food drop-offs where you would come and then we would deliver that food to areas where people could come who were in need of it. I mean, there were so many ways that you sought to embody the resurrection. I love the name of our church, Church of the Resurrection. It's a church that radiates hope and demonstrates selfless love. That's what we're supposed to be. That's what we're supposed to live up to. So I was thinking, I received, somebody sent me this in the mail this last week. It was a little clipping from the Kansas City Star. And I love this. These were, letters to the editor, and somebody had written one, Linda. As far as I know, she's not a part of our congregation. It's called Care for Others. She said, I've been a proud employee of Advent Health Shawnee Mission for 44 years. Its people are known for their compassionate care and provide multiple services to the community. I've been more than excited to participate in the COVID-19 vaccination program that we've offered. I really want to extend a great big thank you to Church of the Resurrection. When the pandemic hit our area, the church organized honk-ins to show support for our staff. The congregation provided several meals to hospital workers who had little time for breaks. Thank you for that. Now the church is opening its doors to help us vaccinate thousands who are anxiously awaiting for their turn for a shot. We've been welcomed with open arms, again with the church, providing meals and wonderful volunteers who help things run as smoothly as they have. You at Church of the Resurrection are definitely doing God's work, and I want you to know how much you are appreciated. Linda, you are appreciated, and all the staff at Advent who've helped make this possible. I mean, you're doing the work, but we've had the privilege of coming along, hundreds of volunteers serving. So far, 37,000 vaccinations that have happened here at Church of the Resurrection as we sought to be in ministry with the community and offering people hope. So this is what I want to ask you. In what ways are you embodying selfless love to people who need it? And how are you incarnating hope? You see, people experience hope today. They experience the resurrected Christ through us. I want to invite us to be people of the resurrection. All right. As we wrap this up, I remind you, this last fall, in the middle of the political polarization, we had a campaign here at the church called Love Your Neighbor. We had street signs that went out, signs went out on the street corners. We had people with their t-shirts, wearing their t-shirts. We were not only wearing shirts and putting out signs, we were living this by acts of kindness. We said, let's do, as many acts of kindness as we possibly can so that somehow in our community, in the midst of all of the challenges of the pandemic, the polarization, the racial injustice, people might feel and see for a moment from us that it might be Friday, but Sunday's coming. Every year at Easter, we give away grants from the Easter offering. So you all will contribute if you choose to in the Easter offering in a few minutes. And the first 100,000 goes to 2 organizations. We vet these. We look to see who is it in the community who we can partner with who is bringing hope to people who are feeling hopeless. This year, we focused on mental health. And so the two organizations that we're supporting as a result of COVID and the increased needs that they have, one is Kansas City Assessment and Triage Center in Jackson County. The other, that's in Missouri. The other is Pathway to Hope in Johnson County, Kansas. And we're going to help expand their programs and help them to be able to offer hope, to incarnate hope and love to their clients. I want you to hear a little bit more about it. Take a listen.
I think that there's a lot of people today, especially since COVID and the pandemic hit, a lot of people are very stressed out. There's a lot of people who have lost their jobs, so they have financial concerns. They may be losing their housing. That puts a strain on everybody, not only the person that it happens to, but the people in their family as well. With that comes high anxiety, comes depression, comes how do I deal with this? So what we like to do is get those people in our door and get them moving on and get them moving on in the right direction. And what I mean by that is let's get them help. Let's get them somewhere. The job of KCATC is to get that initial crisis taken care of. So we want to get people back on their feet so that they can feel good about themselves and that they can start taking care of their family again. Pathway to Hope has been around for about 20 years, and we started out as a support group and education for individuals and families living with mental illness. Since then, we found that the community needed more things, and so we've added peer support and a clubhouse. And a clubhouse is an international model of a day program for adults living with mental illness. We started the clubhouse in November 2019, thinking that our location would be temporary. What we're looking at is a 14,000 square foot building that allows the clubhouse to expand to serve up to 250 a day. At Pathway to Hope, we believe that no one should face mental illness alone, and I think the story of Easter is really God showing up and demonstrating that He's not left us alone.
I love that. And that points to Jesus' commission after Easter. We're to go out into the world and to do the things that He did, teach the things that He taught, and help people see that even though it's Friday, Sunday's coming. All right, I want to end with this. Easter is the story of selfless love and undying hope. It shouts that the worst thing is never the last thing. In Easter, we find that love vanquishes hate. We find that light overcomes the darkness. And in the end, life conquers death. That's Easter. And in the midst of the Fridays that we experience in life and others experience, we need to remember and know Sunday is always coming. This is my 31st year as your pastor here at Church of the Resurrection. I've ended the Easter sermon every year the same way. People ask me from time to time, do you really believe this stuff? Come on, that Jesus was dead and that He rose from the grave, walked out of the tomb. You really believe that? You're too smart for that. And here's what I say every time. I not only believe it, I'm counting on it. And because I'm counting on it, I know that in my Fridays, Sunday is always coming. Let's pray. I'd like to invite you, if you feel comfortable praying, to simply whisper to God and say, thank you for Easter. Thank you for your love and grace. Help me to walk in your hope. Oh God, I thank you for every person who's joining us for worship today. I pray that you would pour out your Holy Spirit upon them and draw them to you. I pray that you would help us to be Easter people. The story is not easy to believe, but when we believe it, when we count on it, we find your joy, we find your peace, we find it easier to face hardship and adversity, and we find we become people who live and breathe hope. Use us, we pray, to that end. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for watching this week's sermon. We'd love for you to join us again online or live in worship. To learn more about Church of the Resurrection, please visit core.org. Have a great week.